See, I don't think it really matters what you do while you're coming. It's what you do when you get there. The opportunity's here. It is my turn. He's had his turn. He's been an inspiration to a lot of people.
Have been.
He still is.
Right. You're not afraid of him?
Afraid of who?
Ali.
Why should I be?
Why are you always in between two brothers agitating?
They called him a lion in the ring, a warrior who traded punches with Muhammad Ali and George Foreman in boxing's golden age. Ron Lyle was a legend, known for his devastating power and superhuman courage. But the celebrated hero America watched on their television screens was also a brutal murderer. The violence that made him famous wasn't born in the boxing ring. It was forged long before, in the streets of Denver, in a prison cell, and it defined every moment of his life. This is the story of how a man convicted of one murder and later charged with a second killing became one of the most beloved figures in sports history. Ronald David Lyle was born on February 12, 1941, in Dayton, Ohio. He was the third of 19 children. Yes, 19. His father was a part-time minister, his mother a missionary. Their faith couldn't feed 19 mouths or create space in a home that was always too small. In 1954, the family moved to Denver, settling into the housing projects on the northeast side. This wasn't a fresh start. It was a descent into deeper poverty, into neighborhoods where survival meant fighting for everything. Growing up as one of 19 kids meant Ron Lyle learned to fight before he learned anything else. Every meal was a competition. Every bit of attention from his parents had to be earned through force. The crowded home created a brutal spirit inside him, a need to dominate just to exist. Outside, the streets of Denver's Whittier and Five Points neighborhoods offered him something his family couldn't give him: status. But that status came with a price. At 17, Lyle dropped out of Manual High School and joined a street gang. He wasn't looking for friendship. He was looking for power, and the gangs gave it to him. All he had to do was prove he was willing to hurt people. The gang life wasn't about brotherhood or loyalty. It was about territory and violence.
Lyle learned quickly that the most respected members were the ones who were the most dangerous, the ones who never backed down, the ones who were willing to cross lines that others wouldn't. He embraced that identity completely. He became known as someone you didn't cross, someone who would respond to disrespect with immediate violence. This wasn't survival anymore. This was a choice. He chose to be feared. He chose to build his reputation on intimidation and aggression. If you're watching this, you need to know the full truth about Ron Lyle. Hit that subscribe button right now, and down in the comments, tell me, can a man truly change after committing murder? Because that's the question at the heart of this entire story. Drop your thoughts below. The violence finally exploded in 1961. Ron Lyle, just 19 years old, was involved in a gang-related shootout that ended with a young man named Douglas Byrd dead on the street. Byrd was 21. His life was over before it really started. And Ron Lyle was the reason why. At trial, Lyle claimed he was attacked first with a lead pipe. He said he didn't pull the trigger. He denied everything. The jury didn't believe him. And why would they? This was a young man who had spent years training himself to be violent, who had chosen gang life, who had built his entire identity around aggression and dominance. The jury found him guilty of second-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to 15 to 25 years in the Colorado State Penitentiary. He would later change his story, claiming he was covering for someone else, that he didn't kill anyone. But that's what guilty men do. They deny reality. They rewrite history to make themselves the victim. The pattern of denial started early and would follow him throughout his life. Lyle never truly accepted responsibility for what happened that day in 1961. He always had an excuse, always had a different version of events. It was always someone else's fault. He was attacked. He was protecting himself.
He was covering for a friend. The story changed, depending on who was asking, but the result was always the same. Ron Lyle positioned himself as the victim of circumstances, rather than the architect of his own destruction. The Colorado State Penitentiary at Cannon City was one of the most brutal prisons in America. If you were sent there, you learned quickly that every day was a fight to stay alive. Ron Lyle found trouble immediately. He was stabbed by another inmate, and the wound was so severe he nearly died on the operating table. Doctors pumped 35 to 36 pints of blood into him, just to keep his heart beating. Some reports even said he was pronounced dead before they brought him back. For most people, a near-death experience like that would be a moment of reflection, a chance to realize they needed to change. But not Ron Lyle. The stabbing was brutal. The blade punctured vital organs, and Lyle bled out so quickly that the prison medical staff couldn't keep up. When they finally stabilized him, he had lost nearly all the blood in his body. He had crossed over into death and somehow came back. But instead of seeing this as a wake-up call, as a sign that his violent lifestyle was going to kill him, Lyle saw it differently. He saw it as proof that he was special, that he was tougher than everyone else, that he could survive anything. The near-death experience didn't humble him. It made him more arrogant. After the stabbing, he was thrown into solitary confinement for 90 days. In the hole, he had nothing. No human contact, no stimulation. Sometimes just a single bowl of spinach to eat each day. And what did he do with that time? He didn't pray. He didn't reflect on the life he had taken or the pain he had caused. Instead, he turned his isolation into an obsession with his own body. He started doing push-ups, hundreds of them, then thousands. He worked himself up to 1,000 push-ups in a single hour, counting every single repetition. It wasn't penance, it wasn't redemption, it was selfish. He was building himself into a weapon, creating order in his life by honing his body into something that could hurt people even more efficiently than before. The obsession with physical perfection became his entire identity. While other inmates used solitary confinement to break down mentally, Lyle used it to build himself up physically. He didn't care about becoming a better person. He cared about becoming a more dangerous person. Every push-up, every sit-up, every squat was about power. It was about creating a body that could dominate others. The counting wasn't meditation. It was calculation. He was preparing himself for a life where physical strength would be his only currency. When he came out of solitary confinement, Ron Lyle dominated every sport in the prison. He coached the prison football team, the Wildcats, to a championship. He starred in baseball and basketball. He was a natural athlete, but his success wasn't about teamwork or discipline. It was about proving he was the alpha, the strongest, the most dangerous man behind bars. On July 4th, 1962, he watched a prison boxing match and had a revelation. He told himself, "I can do that." The prison's athletic director, Lieutenant Cliff Maddox, had tried to recruit him before, but Lyle rejected him with the words of a man who trusted no one. "Man, you're a screw, and I'm a convict. I came here by myself, and I'll leave the same way." But the near-death experience changed his calculation. He realized that boxing could be useful to him, not because it would make him a better person, but because it gave him a path to power. He started fighting in the Prison Boxing League in 1964. His first fight was a loss to an inmate named Texas Johnson. It was the last fight he would lose behind bars. Over the next few years, he fought about 25 times and won 6 inmate heavyweight championships. He wasn't learning discipline or respect. He was learning how to turn his violence into a skill, how to use his fists as tools for domination. Boxing didn't save Ron Lyle in prison. It gave him a new way to hurt people. His approach to boxing in prison revealed everything about his character. He didn't study the sweet science. He didn't learn footwork or defense or strategy. He learned how to hurt people legally. He learned that if he put on gloves and stepped into a ring, he could use all that rage and aggression and violence that had put him in prison in the first place, and people would cheer for him instead of condemning him. It was the perfect outlet for a man who had never learned to control his worst impulses. By 1969, Lyle was eligible for parole, but even the parole board could see what he really was. They rejected him twice, calling a boxing career an unsuitable parole plan for a convicted murderer. They understood that putting a killer in a sport built on violence was a terrible idea. But Ron Lyle got lucky. A Denver philanthropist named Bill Daniels offered him a job as a welder, and that was enough to satisfy the parole board. On November 22nd, 1969, after serving 7.5 years, he walked out of prison a free man. He didn't walk out reformed. He walked out with a plan to become famous. Bill Daniels saw something in Ron Lyle that the parole board didn't, or maybe he just saw an opportunity. Daniels was a wealthy businessman who owned the Denver Rocks boxing team,
and he needed talent. Lyle was raw, powerful, and had a story that could sell tickets. So Daniels offered him a job, not because he believed in rehabilitation, but because he saw potential profit. And Lyle took the offer, not because he wanted to be a welder, but because it was his ticket out of prison and into the boxing ring. From the very beginning, his freedom was built on a transaction, not on genuine transformation. The morning after his release,
He went straight to the Denver Rocks gym to try out for the boxing team. He spent just 15 months as an amateur, but he dominated. He compiled a record of about 25 wins and 4 losses. In 1970, he won the National AAU Heavyweight Championship, knocking out future Olympian Dwayne Bobbick. He won the North American Amateur Championship and the International Boxing League Heavyweight Championship. He made the United States national boxing team. And on April 23, 1971, at the age of 30, he made his professional debut. 30 years old. Most boxers are thinking about retirement at that age, but Ron Lyle was just starting. And that late start defined everything about his career. He didn't have time to learn the art of boxing, to develop skills, to become a tactician. He had to be a knockout artist. He had to hurt people quickly and move on to the next fight. Under trainer Bobby Lewis, Lyle understood that every fight was a race against time. His first 19 professional fights ended with 17 knockouts and an undefeated record of 19-0. He wasn't a skilled boxer. He was a destroyer, using the same brutal power he had used on the streets of Denver, the same violence he had perfected in prison. His early victims included former light heavyweight champion Vicente Rondon and Buster Mathis, both knocked out cold. Then, on February 9, 1973, he lost a decision to Jerry Quarry at Madison Square Garden. It was a setback, but Lyle responded with an 11-fight unbeaten streak, beating former WBA champion Jimmy Ellis and the dangerous Argentinian slugger Oscar Bonavena. By 1974, he had clawed his way to the top of the heavyweight division, but he didn't get there through skill or intelligence. He got there through raw, terrifying violence. The heavyweight division in the 1970s was the most competitive in boxing history. Ali, Foreman, Frazier, Norton, Shavers, Quarry. These were men who would have been champions in any other era, but they all existed at the same time, creating a golden age of the sport. And Ron Lyle forced his way into that conversation not by being the most skilled, but by being the most willing to trade violence. He didn't outbox his opponents, he broke them. He overwhelmed them with pressure and power. It was effective, but it was also a reflection of who he had always been, a man who solved problems with his fists. On May 16, 1975, Ron Lyle stepped into the ring in Las Vegas to challenge Muhammad Ali for the heavyweight championship of the world. For 10 rounds, he fought the fight of his life. He was the aggressor, using his superior strength to bully the greatest boxer who ever lived. He cut off the ring. He refused to fall for Ali's rope-a-dope tricks. He landed hard punches and kept Ali on the defensive. And when the bell rang to start the 11th round, Ron Lyle was ahead on all 3 judges' scorecards. He was 5 rounds away from being the heavyweight champion of the world. But Ali wasn't called the greatest for nothing. Early in the 11th round, he unleashed a devastating right hand that staggered Lyle. He followed up with a furious combination. The referee stopped the fight. Lyle's corner was irate. They screamed that the stoppage was premature, that their fighter had been robbed, and Lyle himself spent the rest of his life claiming he was cheated out of the championship. It's the same pattern we saw after the Douglas Byrd shooting. Ron Lyle denied reality. He refused to accept that he lost. He claimed he was robbed, victimized, cheated. It's what he always did. The loss to Ali became another piece of evidence in Ron Lyle's pattern of denial. He couldn't accept that Muhammad Ali, a superior boxer with better timing and ring intelligence, had simply outfoxed him. Instead, Lyle spent decades telling anyone who would listen that the referee stopped the fight too early, that he was still capable of fighting back, that the championship was stolen from him. It was the same mentality that allowed him to claim innocence in the Douglas Byrd murder. Ron Lyle lived in a world where he was never at fault, where every setback was the result of someone else cheating him or betraying him. 4 months later, on September 13th, 1975, Lyle fought Ernie Shavers in Denver. Shavers was one of the hardest punchers in boxing history. In the second round, Shavers landed a right hand that sent Lyle crashing to the canvas. It was the kind of punch that ended careers. But Lyle got up. He survived the round and began to fight back, absorbing inhuman punishment and dishing it out in return. In the 6th round, he landed a combination that sent Shavers down for the count. It
It's considered Lyle's greatest victory. But let's be honest about what it really was. It wasn't courage. It was his terrifying ability to absorb damage, to take punishment that would kill a normal man, and to use his own violence to destroy his opponent. He won because he was more durable, more brutal, and more willing to hurt someone than Ernie Shavers was. Then came January 24th, 1976. Ron Lyle versus George Foreman in Las Vegas. If the Ali fight was his brush with glory, the Shavers fight was his signature win, the Foreman fight was his ascension into legend. What happened over 5 rounds was pure chaos. It was a back-and-forth war that featured 4 knockdowns. In the 4th round, Lyle knocked Foreman down. Then he knocked him down again. It looked like an impossible victory was happening. But Foreman got up and in the same round dropped Lyle with a thunderous punch of his own. Both men were exhausted, battered, fighting on instinct. In the 5th round, Foreman trapped Lyle against the ropes and unleashed a final assault that ended the fight. Lyle lost, but the fight made him immortal. His legend is built entirely on that savage display of violence. He's remembered not for skill, not for strategy, not for boxing intelligence.
He's remembered for standing in front of George Foreman and trading knockdowns in the most brutal heavyweight fight of the era. His fame is based on his ability to endure and inflict inhuman punishment. That's the Ron Lyle the world celebrated, a man whose greatest asset was violence. The Foreman fight became the defining moment of Ron Lyle's boxing career, but it also revealed the fundamental emptiness of his fame. He was celebrated for his willingness to engage in brutal warfare, for his ability to take punishment and keep coming forward. But what kind of legacy is that? What kind of man builds his reputation entirely on his capacity to hurt and be hurt? The fight was thrilling to watch, but it was also a glimpse into the darkness at the core of Ron Lyle's identity. He had no other way to be great. He had no other way to matter. And then, on New Year's Eve 1977, the violence returned. Ron Lyle shot and killed a man named Vernon "Rip" Clark at his home. Clark was a former prison acquaintance who had worked as an assistant trainer. For the second time in his life, Ron Lyle was arrested and charged with murder. At trial, he claimed self-defense. He said they had been arguing about money. In December 1978, a jury acquitted him. But let's look at what actually happened, because the prosecution's evidence tells a very different story. According to court documents, Ron Lyle admitted to his brothers and a neighbor that he shot Clark. He said, "I shot him." There were no signs of a physical struggle in the room. And here's the most damning fact. Ron Lyle was a 6'3" professional heavyweight boxer at the peak of his physical powers. Vernon Clark was 5 feet 7 inches tall. If Clark had actually attacked Lyle, if there had been a real threat, the size and strength difference would have made it a joke. Lyle could have subdued him without breaking a sweat, but instead he shot him, he killed him, and then he claimed self-defense. Just like he had claimed innocence in the Douglas Byrd shooting 16 years earlier. The jury acquitted him, but the shadow of that second killing ended his career as an elite boxer. People knew, they understood what Ron Lyle really was. The Clark shooting revealed that prison hadn't changed Ron Lyle at all. Boxing hadn't changed him. Fame hadn't changed him. When he felt disrespected, when he felt threatened, his first instinct was still violence. It was still to eliminate the problem permanently. The man who had spent years claiming he was reformed, who had built a career on the discipline and control that boxing supposedly taught him, proved in one moment that it was all a lie. He was still the same 19-year-old gang member who had killed Douglas Byrd. The only difference was now he had money and fame to help him escape the consequences. The fact that Ron Lyle was acquitted in the Clark shooting says more about the American justice system than it does about his innocence. He had a famous name. He had money for good lawyers. He had a jury that wanted to believe the redemption story they had been sold. But the evidence was clear. He admitted to the shooting. There was no physical struggle. The size difference made self-defense absurd. Ron Lyle got away with his second murder because society wanted to believe that the ex-convict boxer was a success story, not a man who had simply found a legal way to channel his violence for a few years before reverting to his true nature. The New Year's Eve shooting also destroyed what little was left of Ron Lyle's credibility. Boxing promoters didn't want to touch him. Sponsors backed away. The public that had cheered for him started asking questions. How many times can you claim self-defense? How many bodies have to pile up before we admit that this man is dangerous? The Clark shooting wasn't just another tragedy. It was proof that Ron Lyle had learned nothing from his first murder conviction, from his years in prison,
from his near-death experience. He was exactly who he had always been. His boxing career fell apart after that. In 1980, at age 39, he was knocked out in the first round by Jerry Cooney, a young, undefeated powerhouse. That loss forced him into retirement. The knockout was devastating, both physically and symbolically. Cooney was young, fresh, powerful, everything that Lyle used to be, and Lyle couldn't last even a single round. It was a harsh reminder that time catches everyone, that violence has an expiration date. The body that had survived the prison stabbing, that had absorbed Ernie Shaver's best shots, that had traded knockdowns with George Foreman, finally broke down. 15 years later, in 1995, inspired by George Foreman's comeback, a 54-year-old Lyle tried to revive his career. He won 4 fights against nobody opponents, hoping to get a big money rematch with Foreman. The fight never happened. It was a sad, desperate attempt to reclaim glory that was long gone. Watching a 54-year-old man fight journeymen in small venues was pathetic. It wasn't inspiring. It wasn't a comeback story. It was a man who had no identity beyond violence, who couldn't let go of the one thing that had ever made him matter. His personal life crumbled too. He worked as a security guard in Las Vegas. He divorced his wife, Nadine. His relationships with his 3 children were complicated and distant. The kids grew up knowing their father was a killer, knowing he had been charged with murder twice. That's not a legacy any child wants to carry. Ron Lyle, the Lion of the Ring, was alone, broke, and forgotten. The violence that had made him famous had consumed everything else in his life. He had built his entire identity on hurting people, and when that was gone, there was nothing left. The divorce from Nadine was particularly painful. She had stood by him through the first murder conviction, through the prison years, through the rise to boxing fame. But the Clark shooting was too much. She couldn't live with a man who had killed twice, who couldn't control his violent impulses, even after everything he had supposedly learned. The divorce left Lyle emotionally shattered, though he would never admit it. Instead, he retreated further into isolation, pushing away the few people who still cared about him. His children struggled with their father's legacy in different ways. Some tried to distance themselves completely, changing their relationship with the Lyle name. Others attempted to maintain contact, but found it difficult to reconcile the man they knew with the brutal history they had inherited. Family gatherings were awkward and rare. Ron Lyle had damaged his family in ways that went far beyond the physical violence he had inflicted on others. The psychological scars he left on his own children would last generations. But here's where the story changes. Here's where Ron Lyle finally became the man he should have been all along. He returned to Denver and found a new purpose. He began mentoring at-risk youth, using boxing as a tool to guide kids away from the streets that had destroyed his own youth. He worked at the Salvation Army's Denver Red Shield gym, and here's the most important detail. He chose to train only amateurs, not professionals. He wasn't chasing money or fame anymore. He was trying to save lives. Ron Lyle spent his final years as a cautionary tale. When he spoke to young people about the consequences of violence, it wasn't a lecture. It was a testimony. He had lived it. He had killed a man, spent years in prison, nearly died on an operating table, killed a second man, and lost everything he had built. He used his story to show kids what happens when you choose violence, when you let anger and aggression define who you are. He became a fixture at the gym, training kids who were exactly like he had been, angry, poor, looking for an identity, teetering on the edge of a life that would destroy them. What made his mentorship powerful was his honesty. He didn't pretend to be a hero. He didn't clean up his past or make excuses. He told those kids exactly what he had done and exactly what it had cost him. He showed them his scars, both the physical ones from the prison stabbing and the emotional ones from a life lived in violence. He made them understand that the path he had walked led only to pain, loss, and regret. And because he had actually lived it, because he had the credibility of experience, those kids listened in a way they wouldn't have listened to anyone else. The work at the Red Shield gym became Ron Lyle's true penance. Every kid he trained, every young person he guided away from the gang life, every life he saved was an act of atonement for the lives he had taken. He couldn't bring back Douglas Byrd. He couldn't undo the shooting of Vernon Clark. But he could make sure that other young men didn't make the same mistakes he had made. He could use his story as a warning, as proof that violence leads nowhere but to destruction. Some of the kids he worked with later said that Ron Lyle saved their lives. They were headed down the exact same path he had walked, and his words stopped them. His brutal honesty about the cost of violence, about the years wasted in prison, about the people he had hurt and killed, made them realize they didn't want to be him. They didn't want to be a cautionary tale. They wanted to be something better. And that's the power of true redemption. It's not about being forgiven. It's about making sure the next generation doesn't repeat your mistakes. He spent hours at that gym, not just teaching boxing technique, but teaching life lessons. He told them about the night he killed Douglas Byrd, about how one moment of rage destroyed 2 families. He told them about the decades of denial, about how he lied to himself and everyone else about what really happened. He told them about Vernon Clark, about how the violence never really left him,
about how fame and success couldn't change who he fundamentally was. And he told them that the only thing that finally changed him was hitting rock bottom, losing everything, and being forced to confront the monster he had become. One young boxer later recalled a conversation where Lyle broke down in tears, something the old fighter almost never did. He talked about Douglas Byrd's mother, about how she looked at him during the trial, about the grief in her eyes that he would never forget. He talked about how he had stolen a son from a mother, how he had destroyed a family, and how no amount of boxing glory could ever make that right. That moment of vulnerability, that genuine display of remorse, changed that young man's life. He walked away from the gang he had been planning to join. The boxing program at the Denver Red Shield Gym is now named the Cox-Lyle Boxing Center in his honor. That's his real legacy. Not the knockdowns, not the wars with Ali and Foreman, not the murders or the trials. His legacy is the lives he saved in those final years. Ron Lyle died on November 26, 2011, at the age of 70, from complications following stomach surgery. Some people close to him believed the illness was connected to the stabbing in prison, the injury that had nearly killed him 40 years earlier. If that's true, then the violence of his youth quite literally followed him to his grave. But before he died, he evolved. The man who had been defined by violence, who had built his fame on his ability to hurt people, who had taken 2 lives, spent his final chapter giving back. He chose to use boxing, the tool that had saved him in prison, to save others. He chose to be a mentor, a guide, a voice of experience for kids who needed to hear that there was another way. If there's anything we can learn from Ron Lyle's story, it's this. Violence is easy, but redemption is hard. Ron Lyle lived most of his life taking the easy path, hurting people, denying responsibility, claiming he was the victim. But in the end, he chose the hard path. He chose to face what he had done and to use that pain to help others. The transformation wasn't instant. It took years of working with kids, years of telling his story over and over, years of seeing the impact his words had on young lives before Ron Lyle truly understood what redemption meant. It wasn't about being forgiven. It wasn't about erasing his past. It was about making sure the future didn't repeat his mistakes. Every kid he guided away from gang life, every young boxer he taught to control his temper, every life he saved was a small act of penance for the lives he had taken and damaged. So if you've made it this far, here's what I want you to do. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because we're going to keep diving into the complicated, messy, true stories of sports legends. And leave a comment telling me, do you think Ron Lyle's final years as a mentor erased the violence of his past, or is redemption something that can never fully wash away the blood? I want to hear your take. Ron Lyle's story isn't a simple one. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He was a man shaped by poverty, by violence, by a system that failed him, and by choices he made himself. He killed at least 1 man, probably 2. He spent years in prison. He fought some of the greatest boxers who ever lived, and in the end, he spent his final years trying to make sure other kids didn't follow his path. That's not redemption in the fairy tale sense. It's not a clean ending, but it's real. It's human. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all. It's never too late to choose a different path, even if you can never fully escape the shadow of who you used to be. Ron Lyle will always be remembered as the brutal murderer who became a boxing legend. He should also be remembered as the man who spent his final years trying to save the kids who reminded him of himself.
The lion finally learned to be gentle, but only after a lifetime of roaring. His story proves that change is possible, but it also shows us the terrible price of violence, and that some debts can never be fully repaid, only acknowledged and worked against for whatever time remains. In the end, Ron Lyle died the way he lived, carrying the weight of his past, but at least in those final years, he carried it with purpose. The gym that bears his name stands as a monument not to his violence, but to his final choice to be something more than the sum of his worst moments.